The morning I found out my husband had sold our company, I was standing in the kitchen making oatmeal. That's the part that stays with me. Not the phone call. Not what he said afterward. Just the oatmeal on the stove bubbling quietly, like nothing in the world had changed. His name is Walter. We've been married for 38 years. I need you to understand something before I go any further. Walter and I didn't just share a life. We shared everything. The early mornings, the arguments about money when there wasn't any, the years when we ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner because we were putting every dollar back into the business. I gave up a teaching career for that company. Not because he asked me to, because we were a team. That's what I believed. Integrity Office Solutions. We started it in 1991 out of our garage in Columbus, Ohio. Walter had the vision. He'd always been the talker, the one who could walk into a room and make people feel like they'd known him for years. But I was the one who kept the books. I handled the vendor contracts, the payroll, the quarterly filings. For the first 4 years, I didn't take a salary. We agreed I would when the business was stable enough. And eventually, it was. By 2019, Integrity had 16 employees and annual revenue of just over $4 million. We had built that. Both of us. I won't pretend our marriage was perfect in those final years. Walter had started pulling away somewhere around 2020. I noticed it, but told myself it was the pandemic, the stress, the uncertainty everyone was feeling. He stopped talking to me about the business. He stopped talking to me about much of anything. I'd ask how things were going with a particular client and he'd say fine and walk out of the room. I told myself he was tired. I was 64 years old and I did not want to see what was directly in front of me. The phone call came on a Tuesday in March. Walter didn't call me himself. His assistant did. A woman named Brianna who'd been with us for 6 years and who sounded genuinely shaken when I picked up. "Mrs. Odom," she said, "I thought you should know. The deal closed this morning." I had no idea what deal she was talking about. Walter had sold Integrity Office Solutions to a regional acquisitions firm called Hartwell Group for $2.3 million. He had signed the papers 6 weeks earlier. He had not told me. He had not asked me. As far as the paperwork was concerned, I did not exist. I set the phone down on the counter very carefully, like it might break. The oatmeal was still bubbling. I turned off the stove and I sat down at the kitchen table and I tried to think. Walter came home that evening acting like nothing had happened. He poured himself a glass of iced tea and stood at the kitchen counter looking at his phone. I watched him for a moment. I thought about all the ways this conversation could go. Then I said quietly, "Brianna called me." He put the glass down. "She shouldn't have done that," he said. "Not, 'I'm sorry I didn't tell you.' Not, 'I was going to explain.' Just, she shouldn't have done that." "Walter," I said, "that is our company." He looked at me then, and I saw something in his face that I hadn't expected. Not guilt. Not shame. Something almost like relief. Like he'd been waiting for this. Like he was ready for it. "It's my company," he said. "My name is on the incorporation papers. I built it." I felt the room shift slightly, the way it does when you realize the ground under you isn't quite as solid as you thought. "You built it," I repeated. "Beverly," he said. "That's my name, Beverly Odom. I've been thinking about this for a while. I think we both know things haven't been right between us for a long time. I've already spoken to an attorney. I'd like you to stay somewhere else while we work this out. The house is in both our names," I said. He paused. "I know, we'll figure that out." I didn't cry. I don't know why. I think some part of me had been waiting for something like this for 2 years, and the actual arrival of it was almost a strange relief, like a storm finally breaking after a long, humid summer. I stood up, rinsed my glass, and said, "I'll be staying right here, Walter." He slept in the guest room that night. By the end of the week, he had moved into an apartment on the north side of Columbus that he told our son had been a temporary rental. Our son, Derek, called me 3 days after Walter left and asked what was happening. I told him the truth as best I could. He was quiet for a long moment and then he said, "Mum, do you have a lawyer?" I didn't, but I got one. Her name was Sandra Chen. She had an office in a 2-story brick building on High Street, and she had silver-streaked hair pulled back tight and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the kind of still, focused energy that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, like I was in capable hands. I brought everything I had, binders I'd kept since 1991, payroll records, tax filings, contracts I had personally negotiated. I had a folder with vendor correspondence going back to 2003, most of it in my handwriting. I had copies of the original business loan applications, which I had co-signed, because in 1993 Walter's credit alone wasn't strong enough to secure the full amount. Sandra went through everything carefully. She asked questions. She made notes. She didn't say much for a long time, and I found that I didn't need her to. Finally, she looked up and said, "Did you know that Ohio is an equitable distribution state?" I shook my head. She explained it to me. Ohio isn't a community property state, which means assets aren't automatically split 50-50 in divorce. But equitable distribution means the court divides marital assets fairly based on contribution. And what counted as a marital asset was the question. Walter's position, through his attorney, was that the business was separate property, his alone, because it was incorporated solely in his name. The sale proceeds, roughly $2.3 million, were sitting in an account he had opened without me. But Sandra had found something. "You co-signed the original business loans," she said, leaning forward slightly. "That matters. But more than that, look at this." She slid a tax return across the desk toward me. For 11 consecutive years, the business was filed as an S corporation. You were listed as an officer of the company, not an employee, an officer. I stared at the document. I had signed those returns every year. Walter had always handed them to me and said, "Sign here." And I had signed the way you do when you trust someone completely. "He listed you as an officer for tax purposes," Sandra said, "because it was beneficial for him to do so at the time. What he didn't anticipate is that it creates a paper trail of your role in the company going back over a decade." I sat very still. "Beyond that," he continued, "your contributions to the business, unpaid labor in the early years, contract negotiations, financial management, those are documentable. We have your records. Equitable distribution doesn't just look at whose name is on the incorporation. It looks at the full picture of what each spouse contributed to building the marital estate. Walter," she told me, "had also made a significant legal error. Under Ohio law, a business that was built during the marriage using marital resources, including my labor, my co-signed loans, money that flowed through our joint household, is generally considered a marital asset, regardless of how the incorporation documents read. There was also the matter of how the sale had been handled. He had transferred a portion of the proceeds, roughly $400,000, into a separate account 2 days before he filed for divorce. Sandra said that kind of movement, when it happens in close proximity to a divorce filing, has a name: fraudulent transfer, and courts do not look kindly on it. I had a question I'd been sitting with for 3 weeks by then. I asked it. "Sandra, why didn't he just tell me he wanted a divorce? Why all of this? Selling the company first? Hiding the money, all of it?" She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Because he thought if the asset was already gone, already converted to cash and moved, the divorce proceedings would be simpler for him. He thought you'd take what he offered and not ask questions." She paused. "A lot of husbands in situations like this are counting on their wives not to know what they're entitled to." Something settled in me when she said that. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. The next 4 months were not easy. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Walter hired a very aggressive attorney, a man named Clark, who sent long technical letters that seemed designed primarily to be confusing and exhausting. There were depositions. There were financial disclosures. There was a morning when Walter and I sat on opposite sides of a conference table for 4 hours while our attorneys argued over spreadsheets, and I looked at this man I had made oatmeal for 38 years and I barely recognized him. Derek drove up from Cincinnati twice to sit with me. He didn't say much. He made coffee and watched baseball games with me on the couch, and that was enough. My daughter-in-law sent food in those little insulated bags, more than I could ever eat. There were nights I couldn't sleep, and I would sit in the kitchen at 2 a.m. and look out at the backyard, the garden I'd spent 20 years building, the rose beds along the fence, the old oak that Walter and I had always said we'd put a bench under someday, and I would feel the full weight of it. 38 years. The life we had made. How quietly it had come apart. But I had my records. I had Sandra. And I had the co-signed loan documents from 1993. The mediation happened in late August. Walter's attorney had by then received Sandra's full documentation, the tax filings, the loan records, the vendor contracts in my handwriting, a detailed accounting of my labor contributions in the company's early years. There was also the matter of the $400,000 transfer, which Sandra had flagged formally, and which created an exposure for Walter that his attorney apparently did not want going before a judge. Walter did not look at me during the mediation. He sat with his arms crossed and stared at the table. Clark did most of the talking. By the end of the day, we had reached an agreement. I received 47% of the net sale proceeds from Integrity Office Solutions, approximately $1.08 million after legal fees. I kept the house, which was the one thing I had been most afraid of losing. Walter kept his retirement accounts and a small rental property he'd purchased in his name in 2018. The fraudulent transfer issue was resolved by including that $400,000 in the calculation of the total marital estate. I also received my share of the marital retirement savings we built together, which Walter had not factored into his original plan at all. He had walked out of our marriage believing he'd been clever, that he'd structured things in a way that protected what he saw as his. He had underestimated 38 years of records kept in careful binders. He had underestimated Sandra Chen. And he had underestimated what a woman finds out about herself when she has absolutely nothing left to lose. The divorce was finalized in November. On the day the paperwork was signed, Derek drove up and took me to dinner at a little Italian place in Clintonville that we'd always liked, just the two of us. We ordered too much pasta and shared a piece of tiramisu. And he held my hand across the table and said, "You okay, Mom?" "I think so," I said. And I meant it. I moved the rose bushes to raised beds the following spring. My knees aren't what they were, and the bending had gotten difficult. I finally put a bench under that old oak. I sit there most evenings when the weather's good. I've been working my way through a stack of novels I never had time to read when I was spending my energy managing someone else's vision of our future. I think about what I would tell a woman in the position I was in on that Tuesday morning when Brianna called, what I wish someone had told me. Don't leave your house. Whatever you do, don't leave your house before you've spoken to an attorney. I know the instinct when everything feels impossible is to get away from it, to give the other person what they want, just to make the discomfort stop. Don't. Keep records of everything. I kept records out of habit, a schoolteacher's habit, the habit of someone who grew up in a family where documents mattered. Those records gave me back my life. Know what you're entitled to. Most women in long marriages contributed enormously to building what their families have. Most women don't know their contributions are legally recognized and financially quantifiable. Find out. Before the conversation you're afraid to have, before the papers are filed, find out. And find a Sandra. I'm 65 years old now. I have a house with a garden and a bench under an oak tree, and a stack of books, and, for the first time in a very long time, mornings that belong entirely to me. Some days I make oatmeal. I stand at the stove and watch it bubble, and I think about that Tuesday in March, about Brianna's voice on the phone, about the way I sat down at the kitchen table and tried to think. I thought clearly. That's the one thing I got right. When everything was falling apart, I sat down and I thought clearly. The rest followed from that. I've had a lot of time to think about how things unfold. Not in a dramatic, sudden way, but slowly, over years, through the small choices people make when they think no one is paying close attention. Walter made a choice in 1993 when he asked me to co-sign those business loans because his credit alone wasn't enough. He made a choice every year when he handed me the tax returns and said, "Sign here." And I signed because I trusted him and because I was, in every practical sense, an officer of that company. He made a choice in 2024 when he decided that 38 years of my labor, my sacrifice, my careful record-keeping, all of it, could simply be erased with a wire transfer and a signature he didn't think I'd ever question. What Walter didn't understand is that choices accumulate. They don't disappear just because enough time passes. I think about the woman I was the morning Brianna called. 64 years old, standing in my kitchen, not sure I had anything left. I had built a life around a partnership I believed in, and in the space of one phone call, the ground had shifted completely. What I didn't know yet, what I had no way of knowing, was that the very thing Walter had used to dismiss me, all those years of quiet work, all those binders I kept out of habit, all those documents I'd filed without ever imagining I'd need them, that was exactly what gave me everything back. There's something I've come to understand about integrity that has nothing to do with business names or incorporation papers. Integrity is what you do in the ordinary moments, the moments that don't seem to matter. It's the record you keep when no one is watching. It's the loan you co-sign because you believe in something. It's the Tuesday mornings you show up and do the work that doesn't have your name on it. Those things don't vanish. They exist in paper trails and tax filings and vendor contracts. They exist in the memory of people like Brianna, who picked up the phone and called me because she thought I deserved to know. Walter built his plan on the assumption that I wouldn't know my own worth. That's where it fell apart. Not in the courtroom, not in the mediation room. It fell apart the moment I sat down at my kitchen table and thought clearly instead of panicking. I want to say something to anyone watching this who is in the middle of what I was in the middle of. The disorientation is real. The grief is real. You can love someone for 38 years and still have to stand across a conference table from them and fight for what you built together. Both of those things can be true at once, and neither one cancels the other out. But here is what else is true. You are not starting from nothing. You never were. Everything you contributed, everything you gave, everything you showed up for quietly and without recognition, it counts. It has always counted. You just need someone like Sandra to help you prove it. The house is still mine. The garden is still growing. The bench under the oak tree is exactly where I put it. Some evenings I sit there and I think about cause and effect, how every action sets something else in motion, how the choices we make in ordinary moments build the foundation we stand on when everything gets hard. Walter made his choices. I made mine. The difference was that mine were recorded, documented, and 38 years deep. That's not luck. That's a life lived with intention, even when you didn't know you were building anything at all.